Municipalisation. And I'm Anna Biondi. I'm the Deputy Director of the Bureau for Workers' Activities of the ILO. And the Bureau was very happy to accept the invite that came from Public Service International and ITF to global unions to bring together, this possibility of this discussion in an ILO settings and together with the two representatives that I will introduce afterwards. We also have Professor, let me say right away, from PSI, we have Daria Cibrario, that is the Policy Officer for Local and Regional Governments, and James Bartolomeus, that is the Urban Transport Manager for ITF. And together with them, there is Professor Andrew Chambers of the Adam Smith Business School of the University of Glasgow. Each of them will introduce quite interesting points about this, the need and the possibility of remunicipalization. It's very difficult to say, municipalization. Anyway, it's easier in Italian, but I cannot use my mother language in this event. So why I think it's relevant, and we'll certainly hear from our colleagues. But certainly, besides the fact that very often we have heard and we have seen a progress towards privatization of public services, I think that the work that the colleagues have done for what I've seen is that also that movements and changes in a way or another are always complicated. And I think I appreciated the fact that the colleagues are saying, not only what we should be doing, but, which are the challenges and how we should address them. I must say that it is relevant to be in the ILO also because when we did especially the reflection on the future of work linked to the 2019 100th anniversary of the ILO, it's like indeed, we started discussing which is the future for the work, what's the best in order to secure not only decent working conditions, but also a new idea of development, which is enshrined in the ILO Constitution, if you want still. And in 2019, we adopted, the ILO constituents adopted the declaration on, indeed, the centenary declaration, where very clearly it is stated, supporting the role of the public sector as a significant employer and provider of quality public services. I want to quote this because of the structure of the ILO, the tripartite structures, very often we have an idea of the ILO that is only looking at the private sector. No, it's like very much the public sector has to be part of the equation as, the cooperatives, other forms of work. And I think in the future, this role should even become more relevant. Of course, after the 2019, what happened, and we know what happened in the world, was COVID-19, and the fact that not only, that we saw how relevant it was to have quality public services and the need for especially health services to be in the front line, and how these they showed how I must say that we could see also the damage and sometimes part of the problems in the response of the public service was also linked to their privatization in the past. And I think that also it's like in the ILO we are working, and especially Director General Gilbert Rumbo wants to work on social justice, a coalition for social justice. So once more, I would say the need to make sure that quality public services and a future indeed for quality public services is enshrined in the ILO work. Of course, this is you know, it's what I think it's quite interesting from what the colleagues will inform us and will tell us is the fact that, you know, very often we only hear the trend, the pendulum that is going from public services to private services. Again, you know, this is a challenge, but they say, no, this can be reversed. We have ideas and we have also examples, you know. So I don't want to take their time because I think that it's very important that we hear directly from them. We are not divided, men and women, for a reason of sex segregation, but simply because this is the order in which we are going to speak. And so allow me right away to give the floor to Daria Cibrario from Public Service International, local and regional governments. And the topic will be indeed what is and why local authority workers and community are embracing again the remunicipalization of jobs. Daria and James will share the platform on this, and I thank you already the colleagues from the ILO and above that came and are here. We want also to have time at the end for a Q&A if you want, and you know, just that this has to remain a friendly exchange, but I think absolutely needed in this context. Daria, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for this warm welcome to PSI, ITF, and University of Glasgow, but also to the topic. We very much appreciate that ACTRAV and the ILO have actually accepted to hold this seminar workshop, and thanks for your time, be you here or online. We really look forward to this conversation. So if you look at the very concise agenda we've shared and the ILO ACTRAV has circulated, indeed, so the two GAFs, the two global union federations, PSI and ITF, will give you a bit of the political and policy contextualization to this concept of remunicipalization. Some call it insourcing. We will go just very quickly through some of the terminology to become more familiar with it. But then I would say that the very important piece, if you are to only attend a part of today, is the second part with Professor Cumbers, who will give you some data and evidence-based analysis on the deprivatization trend, because as Anna has very well explained, since the 80s, we've been told that there's privatization, but I really would like to see and hear, and perhaps we'll do this quick survey in a few minutes, how many of you have actually heard that there's actually a reverse global trend ongoing. So with that introduction, I would just start with a PowerPoint. We've got a couple of PowerPoints. They look quite wordy, especially ours because of me, but we will just pass through it. And the idea is to have a visual support to talk you through some topics. We also have with us a list of resources that are accessible online, and after the presentation and the end of the workshop, for those of you who are interested, we will ask the ILO kindly to send it to those who request it. So let me just start with the presentation. What we're going to do in hopefully no more than 20-25 minutes is to take you through these 4 key steps. So for those of you who are not familiar with our organizations, just a few words about each of them. Then we'll talk very quickly through some key terminology so that we know what we're talking about. And then I would like to, there's many angles to remunicipalization and insourcing or deprivatization, but I think that one of the most powerful ones is the fact that when you deprivatize or insource or remunicipalize, we are starting to accumulate some pretty strong hardcore evidence that you can tackle effectively inequalities. And at a time of multi-crisis, a public policy tool that helps to fight inequalities is a very important one, because it also helps us advance towards the sustainable development goals. So we'll take a quick look at that. And then we'll tell you very briefly what ITF and PSI have been doing and continue to do on remunicipalization, how we've started to get organized around it. And actually, one of the first steps, we took it in 2018 in this very house. And then we would also like to offer opportunities for collaboration, debate, and would like to hear from you about whatever work that you're doing linked to this kind of issues. So with no further ado, just a few words about, I start myself, and then obviously I'll pass over to James. PSI's Public Services International. We are the global trade union federation representing workers across all public services at all levels of government. That doesn't mean uniquely public sector. It means public services, be them publicly delivered, privately delivered, delivered by community services, and so on and so forth. There's a big variety of way to deliver services, as you know. But our value and our vision for public services is one of universal, equitable, fair access at point of use of a sufficient quality for all. So just so that you know, as local government officer, I have basically members in waste services, energy, in sometimes health and social care, but also firefighters, public emergency workers, local administration, and so on and so forth.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me over the laptop. I'll just introduce myself as I'll be sharing this platform with Dario throughout the presentation. My name is James Bartholomew's. I work at the International Transport Workers Federation, as you can see here. Similarly to PSI, we are a global union federation. We were founded initially in the maritime sector in 1896, but we've since expanded to represent transport workers worldwide across a whole range of transport modes, including civil aviation, tourism, road, railways, and where the area I focus on, public transport. We bring together around 20 million transport workers across these modes in 700 affiliated trade unions across 153 countries worldwide. Within that, our public transport program, which is the program I work on, is focused on building strong labour standards in local public transport, but crucially as part of a broader social model, which includes the interests of passengers and communities. And it's an area where we work in particularly close cooperation with PSI as part of the wider local and regional government agenda that Dario has outlined.
Thank you, James. And indeed, we work very closely together because without public transport, it's virtually impossible for many communities, for many people, especially in rural areas, in small towns, to access life-saving public services such as health, but also education, and so on and so forth. This is why we have a very strong collaboration, and we see the shared interest on this agenda. So let's go through some of the terminology, because very rightly Anna was telling us remunicipalization is a hard word to pronounce. Many English speakers tell us, well, it's really hard. Can we say insourcing? But in fact, there are two slightly different meanings to these words. Well, before we just go into the the content of the terminology. I'm really curious, just looking at those in the physical room today, because I cannot see who's in the virtual room, but how many of you had come across this word, remunicipalization, before? Can you just raise your hand? So just 2. Okay. How many had heard the word privatization? Everyone. How many of you had heard insourcing? 4. And how many of you have ever heard about deprivatization? Yeah. So we can really see that there is a blind spot, as Andrew will tell you more in the second part of the presentation, because as we've all been told that privatization was the only way to go, especially in the 80s, what we are seeing as trade unions, but also because of the allied organizations in civil society and progressive movements, but also academia is looking at this, there is a global trend of bringing back services that had been, or assets, public assets that had been previously sold or privatized in very many different forms, either 100% or given out into concessions or opened up to shareholder and stock market investors' participation, back into the full ownership or control and management of the public. Being the public here, not just the traditional, perhaps sometimes obsolete central government monolithical state, but many forms or many different ways of intending public. It can be at a local level, can mean with elements of democratic ownership. It can mean with the participation of the workers and the community. So it's a really innovative areas that we're looking at here. And there's also this word called municipalization, which is the creation of a new public service that had not existed before, that still meets a collective need, and it meets it in a way which is decommodified, meaning that it's not intended to produce a profit and share it among shareholders, but just to really meet a collective need. It could be, for instance, the creation of a canteen in a school that has never had a public canteen where the subsidized meals for children of disadvantaged areas, for example. And then if we look at insourcing, well, that is the opposite of outsourcing. Why was I saying that it has a slightly different meaning than remunicipalization? Because it focuses on the staff, on the workers. And since we're here in the house of industrial relations, this could be of interest to you. Usually, there can be, for example, in a public institution, the outsourcing through public procurement as well of certain areas of the institutions. It can be the payroll, it can be the cleaning services, and so on. Sometimes this goes just through an external labor agency, and so it is the staff which is externalized. In our experience, this causes very severe problems, very often in terms of working conditions, access to rights, and so on and so forth. And so we are seeing increasingly some local authorities or public utilities or even public companies that go back and insource some of their staff. And then in the big box of deprivatization, we put all of the above, but we can also add the context of nationalizations or renationalizations, which are basically the bringing back of these assets, institutions, and services, but at a national, central government level. And that happens much less frequently because it is a more complex process. And you will hear more about how these processes can actually occur concretely in Andy's presentation. So let me just focus on this connection, which in my view is something that the ILO and practitioners and researchers and policymakers, like many of you here in this house, could be interested in. Without going into the details of what you will see on the slides, my point here is that there is clearly, and I think you will concur, a lack of systematic research that shows what we can see anecdotally on a regular basis, which is that equitable access to public services of sufficient quality for all are an extremely powerful tool to tackle inequalities and advance us collectively on the path for the SDGs. And if we look at what is available in terms of data, there's not much. One perhaps of the most telling data we've found is this report from the OECD, which dates back to 2012, that shows that when services are universally provided for free, not even with user fee, and especially when it is about health and education, that becomes a real 20% basically reduction, poverty reduction tool, especially for the poorest households in a country. So let's go on. And the other thing is that if we look at the SDGs, all of them, including SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, they're all in a way or another directly linked to these access to public services, energy, water and sanitation, healthcare, even housing, but also I would say social protection. We're starting to expand the realm of what we consider a public service. I think that COVID, with the urgency and the mega crisis that has plunged us all collectively, has helped us to consider other areas that were previously thought to be uniquely as a market, as essentials, as life-saving, food, public transport, of course, social protection, housing. Is housing just a market? I think the discussion can now, after COVID, be expanded and put in a different light. And if we continue, if we look at what COVID has done to public services and to our communities, we can really see a direct correlation with the privatization of life-saving services and different kinds of inequalities. We are used to think about inequalities in terms of income inequalities, but in fact, there are many other forms that COVID has particularly unveiled. There's territorial inequality, the inequality which stems from where you are living. Is it an affluent area in an urban megalopolis, which has all the services at hand and a good labor market, or are you in a remote area where there's no public transport because it's not profitable? Are you, or there's also, of course, gender inequality, but we have started to look at what we call public service access inequality. And when we look at that, we see that not only in the global south, this is an issue, but even in the global north. I just want to mention one or two concrete cases. Long-term care in Canada during COVID has exposed the fragility of the privatized long-term home cares for elderly people. This is a system which has been privatized over the past 2 decades, and the rate of death linked to COVID of the residents in these private facilities has been the highest of all the developed countries, including the contamination rates for care workers. And as a result, the state of Saskatchewan in Canada has decided to invest 80 million Canadian dollars to build 13 new homes, public facilities, and to take back and renovate 82 of them that were previously in the public realm. Another example is the one of Chile. Chile, as we all know, has been a a very neoliberal country where since the 70s, where services, including health and medicines, have been privatized. And that has created a real divide, especially for the lowest income earners who have not had access to medicines. And as a result, if we go to the next slide, one city of Chile, Recoleta, started the practice of having a municipal public pharmacy, basically producing, on the one hand, its own generics, but also subsidizing medicine access for the lowest income tiers of the local community. And today in Chile, there's 80 of these municipal pharmacies. And that has created a possibility for the least affluent dwellers in the community to have equitable access to medicines in a country which does not, in general, allow that for those who cannot afford to pay. But one very concrete and quite flagship case of how remunicipalization can help us collectively advance towards social, environmental goals, but also I would say resilience at times of crisis, is the case of Paris Water. Paris Water was remunicipalized in 2010 by Mayor Bernard Delanoë. Basically, the concession that had lasted 25 years to French multinationals Veolia and Suez was discontinued. And basically, a public utility was created to deliver water without profit, just on a public good approach. And just doing that, there have been over 70 million revenue savings over the first few years, which have enabled to do two things that the two private providers had never done over the past 25 years. The first one was to invest in the pipes and in the distribution system, which had leakages everywhere. And the second was to lower user fee so that more residents could access water at a decent price. And on top of that, a lot of water fountains have appeared all over the city, and Paris is one of the rare cities in the world where you can have sparkling water at a fountain, which helps us all reduce plastic waste and consumption. So these are just a few examples to give you a sense of what is the potential of bringing services back in-house in an intelligent, in a collective, and in a thoughtful way. We convened for the first time to bring together collective knowledge and experience of what it means to bring back services in-house, including from the labor perspective. What does it mean under an employment law, but also sociological angle, to bring back workers who have been privatized? And then we've started actually to write about it, to advocate and to disseminate our collective knowledge. And we've started to make some inways also in important fora. And we will tell you in a moment. Please go for this one. Secretary quadriennial report on the advancement of the new urban agenda last year mentioned remunicipalisation as a viable and a legitimate policy to fight inequalities and enable access to quality public services, especially for the poor. This has also been picked up by the United Cities and Local Governments organization, which is the global, basically, federation of local authorities and cities worldwide. And we are being contacted also by some local governments who want to discuss with our remunicipalization union expert group their implementation of a law on insourcing that has reversed the outsourcing first policy that Australia had for 20 years in the autonomous territory of Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. These are just some examples of how this policy has started to pick up. And if you want to read more, we will share with you the full article.
Yes, excellent. And I'm sure that we will share, and I'm sure that you will get more feedback, including afterwards some feedback if you want on Q&A. But I would say, as it was decided before, if you don't mind, I have some question already about what you said, but I think it's extremely important and interesting to listen now from Professor Andrew Chambers, not only for the topic, because it says the topic is it is a global trend, and that's interests me, because sometimes you think this is only happening in in the West or certain parts of the world, but also that I understand that the professor is handling a database on the public futures that I think is quite interesting, including from the ILO. Please, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be invited here to speak at the ILO. Just waiting for the slides to come up. Okay, so I'm Andrew Chambers. I work at the Adam Smith Business School, the University of Glasgow, and what I'm going to talk about today, there's really sort of three things. Firstly, to give you a little bit of a background about the global trends around remunicipalisation. Daria's already mentioned that research. I'll be sort of reflecting upon what the trends tell us in terms of research findings. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about a database that we've created called the Public Futures Database, which I think has been very important in the work that we're doing. So the work that we've been doing at Glasgow on remunicipalisation comes out of a European Research Council project with partners, including PSI, but also the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. And we've been researching both the global trends and processes at work in remunicipalisation, but we've also been looking at case study countries around the world, particularly in Europe, Germany, but also the US is quite an interesting epicenter of this, as I'll say in a minute. And we've also been doing work in South America, and more recently we've been doing a little bit of work in Spain and also back in the UK. So I think if you're interested in that kind of work, I'll have some publications at the end of my my presentation today, which sort of follow up on that. But I'm going to talk really about the global trends today. I'm going to reflect upon what I think those mean in research terms, and then I give you a little bit of information about this public futures database that we've created. I should say that there's a website, there's a project website which you can find at the University of Glasgow, which you can see on the slide. So the first thing to say, as Darius already mentioned, is that in the period, particularly since the year 2000, we've seen a massive growth in what we would call remunicipalisation, but I think deprivatization generally, a massive trend, an accelerating trend up in particularly into the 2010s in the number of cities, towns, and subnational territories around the world that have been taking back assets, infrastructures, and services that have been previously privatized. Darius also mentioned cases of municipalisation where new public services have been created, and I think we tended in our definition of remunicipalisation, we tend to include examples of new public services because they're often created in the absence of the private sector delivering those things. So that's an important part of the trend as well. So when we talk about the broader macro process of global remunicipalisation, we do actually include these new municipal entities that are being created as well. And what we've been doing in recent years is kind of cataloging these cases, and this has led to the creation of this public futures database, which I'll say a little bit about in a minute. But you can see from the just from the graphic that we've put up that this process really accelerated in the first decade of the 2000s, and then certainly after 2010 we saw another upsurge, and we continue to catalog the cases as we go forward into the 2020s. If we look at the geography of all this, as has already been said, it is a global process. It's happening all the way around the world, as you can see from the maps that we've got here. And we've identified so far over 1,600 cases. We continue to find new ones almost every week. And I think it's fair to say also that we are a little bit dependent, and I'll say a little bit more about this when I talk about the public futures database. We're a little bit dependent on our grassroots activists, trade union officials, and local government officials that report. So we think this trend is probably just not kind of capturing the universality of deprivatization and remunicipalisation. So we think there's probably a lot more out there, particularly when we go beyond our kind of sort of resource activist sort of areas of Western Europe, North America. Where we know much more about what's going on. But I think it's fair to say that the trend is very much concentrated in Western Europe, particularly Germany and France, where there was a lot of privatization of energy and water in particular in the 1990s. And what's happened, particularly in Germany, is as a lot of private energy contracts have come up, what they did in Germany is they didn't fully privatize, they actually kind of outsourced or had a franchise deal. And what you find with a lot of municipalities in Germany, in the energy sector in particular, is as those franchises have come up for renewal, more and more cities and towns have been taking them just back into public ownership and public ownership. But there's so Europe is very much the epicenter. Surprisingly, the USA is also a strong area, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But we're also seeing in more recent years growing epicenters emergent in Spain and the UK. In the global south, we can say that remunicipalisation it is occurring, but it's so far been less prevalent. And I think that's largely because privatization hasn't been as prevalent in parts of the global south, except perhaps in the water sector. And there've been some very well-known struggles to bring back water into public ownership in places like Jakarta and Cochabamba. And I think we're seeing this interesting phenomenon in Chile of these new private, where the sort of privatized health sector is failing to deliver basic medicines, where we've seen an upsurge recently in the growth of public pharmacies. When we look at how this is all happening, okay, the geography is uneven, mainly concentrated in the global north, but it's quite interesting the kinds of what we would call deprivatization that are happening. We do focus on this term remunicipalisation, but because we find that the vast majority of deprivatization activities are at the local level, local subnational level, and where it's local governments that are doing it. The database that I'm going to talk about also captures examples of renationalisation as well, but you can see from the graphic that there's a very small percentage of these deprivatizations that are actually at the national level. Most of them are occurring at the municipal level. And I think what's interesting from our perspective is that we see a sort of almost 2/3 of these are sort of the taking back of formerly privatized sectors and activities into public ownership. We're also seeing the growth of new forms of public ownership in about 1/3 of the cases. And the other thing I'd highlight that's on this slide really, and I'd point to, is that we're seeing some quite interesting ownership models emerging. It's not, as Dario mentioned before, it's not a return to kind of older forms of state ownership in many cases, but we're seeing some very interesting hybrid forms of public ownership being created, where there's often sort of shared ownership models between municipal authorities and often cooperatives, or even worker ownership in some cases. What's happening in Germany is very interesting in the energy sector, whereby we're seeing a lot of local public authorities, when they reclaim their energy grid, they're often setting up cooperatives for renewable energy generation. So that's a very interesting trend in trying to include civil society. So I think what I'd emphasize here is that it's not just about local governments reclaiming crucial assets, but it's also in some cases about trying to construct very different forms of public ownership, much more democratic perhaps and transparent than in the past in some cases. If we look at the sectoral trends in terms of what's happening, so far it's been very dominated by the energy and the water sector. If you look at the pie chart that's there, you can see that around about 1/4 of the cases, just under 1/4, are in energy or in the water sector. And again, the reason for that is, I just flip forward quickly. If we look at what happened in privatization during the 1990s, it was water and energy. And if you look at the chart there, the orange line in particular, it was the European Union that was really at the epicenter of privatization. And not surprisingly, therefore, if we can click back again, not surprisingly, therefore, it's in the water sector, and in particular in Germany and France, that we've seen so much remunicipalisation going on. But as the 21st century has developed, I think we've seen a growing level of insourcing and taking ownership back occurring in other sectors as well, healthcare and social services, as we've already talked about. Increasingly, there's also a trend we see in both Spain and the UK for local governments to basically bring outsourced services back in-house. We've seen a little bit of transport renationalisation in the UK, particularly with the Scottish government has recently taken its rail franchise back in-house. But I'd also point to some really interesting things happening in the US, where it's not so much a kind of deprivatization, remunicipalization process that's going on, but in areas like the broadband sector, we're seeing new public enterprises being set up locally, and that's because of the complete failure of the US telecoms market, which is very deregulated and privatized. A complete failure to provide local services, and obviously with the growth of broadband in the last couple of decades, very often the quality of public spaces for internet and communications is very poor. So we're seeing a growing number of local authorities, and I think it's fair to say that that's not just dependent on political affiliations. A growing number of US towns and cities, particularly in rural areas, are creating their own local public broadband networks. And the one thing that we've been researching in the last year that's fascinating in the US as well is there's a growing movement for public banking, for creating new public banks, places like New York, but also in California. Particularly after the financial crisis, there's been a growing social movement in the US around, well, okay, we've had the financial crisis, we've seen the mess that Wall Street's created. What do we do about it? And there is this emergent movement in the US, and already some campaigns at state level that they've actually passed a bill in the California legislature now to create public banks at the city level in California, and in New York they're trying to do the same thing. And one of the reasons for that was they realized during the COVID pandemic in New York that a lot of ethnic minority businesses and indeed employees were not really covered at all by basic social services, had little access to finance, and therefore there's this big motivation to sort of provide sort of public financing where the private sector's failed. So there's some fascinating trends that are out there, and in a way our project, although it's 5.5 years long, we're only really scratching the surface in terms of what's going on. But we can perhaps come back to you another time when we've got some results and some written up work on the US. Why is it all happening? I think broadly speaking, we find that there's a diverse set of geographies to remunicipalisation. I think you find global trends intersect with particular local conditions. But we can broadly point to a kind of global set of shared experiences of real failure from privatization and marketization of public services. And what comes through in all the sectors and research is the increased cost and the user tariffs of using private services. We often find that also privatization has a particularly big impact upon marginalized and poorer communities once you begin to introduce a kind of market pricing mechanisms in different sectors. That's been particularly the case in water sector in the global south. Again, a continuing story that we hear is that the privatization does not lead to the promised investment and modernization of infrastructure that was promised, and that's that again seems to be quite universal. There's also a sense of poor performance of privatized services. And in some cases, particularly in France in the 1990s, there was massive evidence of corruption and rent seeking from private delivery. The real worry, if kind of mainstream progressive political actors don't find solutions to some of the big crises that we face, we can see the far right and perhaps more populist forms of nationalism or state control ownership coming back to sort of deal with some of these issues we face. I think it's quite interesting in the in France in particular, if you look at the Le Pen and the far right, that they've got their own public ownership agenda, which is a very exclusionary one. And I think there's a real fear there that if the mainstream doesn't really understand the importance of public ownership and control and a democratic form, then we might get a much more extreme version down the line as privatization continues to fail. If I've got time, I'm going to say a little bit about the public futures data that we've created, because the findings that I've shown with you, the global trends have been created through this amazing work that's been carried on since, particularly since 2007 onwards, by the Transnational Institute, PSI, and a whole series of other NGOs and trade unions around the world that have begun to kind of catalogue the process of deprivatization as it's emerged. And I'd also highlight the work of the CIRU at the University of Greenwich here. So there's been a whole number of activists and movements that have begun to kind of map this process, which has been occurring since the 2000s, and these are just some of the publications that we've already talked about. Out of that, I think in 2021 we got some money, the University of Glasgow, working with the Transnational Institute and PSI, to create a new database, because a lot of those cases that I talked about, those 1,600 cases as they are now, for a while they were just in a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, which Satoko Kishimoto TNI was sort of keeping on her laptop, and we said, well, let's try to create an online database that is kind of secures this data. And the critical thing about this, I think, is that if you look at the official awareness of deprivatization and remunicipalisation, there's almost a blind spot there as Darius mentioned, in some of the official governance documents. It's only now that the UN, for example, have been waking up to the importance of remunicipalisation. And it's quite fascinating if you look at the lack of acknowledgement of key agencies and institutions to recognise this trend, because of course it's partly because it doesn't fit with their narrative. And there's some sort of cognitive dissonance going on there. I don't know, but I think what we found is there's no real official data about this trend compared to the data that's out there on privatization. So what we've done is we've created this database. You can view it online, and we're just going through a new second. The database has been updated recently, and we're having a relaunch, I think, this week. And it's a first attempt really to sort of really catalogue this process. But whilst we are very keen to measure deprivatization and remunicipalisation, we're also very aware of not overclaiming what we're finding here, because it's a crowdsourced database, and there's all sorts of issues with the crowdsourced methodologies. Most of the reporting is by activists and trade unions. So for us, there's a massive issue about verification, transparency, and openness about the limitations of our data. So although we've created this database, we don't want to overclaim from it. I mean, we do have some figures and statistics on motivations and some of the processes behind remunicipalisation, and they're written up in a paper that I'll show you at the end. But I think we're very careful about what we claim and what we don't claim, because we recognise the need for transparency. And again, if you look at the database, we have a whole methodological section there where we talk about how the data is gathered, what it can tell us and what it can't tell us. So, but we're hugely enthused by this kind of this process and this database, and you know, we're really looking to sort of strengthen the database and our knowledge about what's there. But it's an ongoing project, and you can see these are some of the graphics that you get out of the database that we're creating. So the database is really a kind of commons in a way. It's a kind of commons where we're supplying data, and we've got NGOs, trade union activists, local government officials giving us data that we then try and verify and check against local press reports and these kind of things to ascertain its validity. And I think that's an important process. So it's a very open process. It's a very collaborative process across sectors and communities. And we do want to encourage research on the back of creating the database. But again, we need to be very careful about what we can claim statistically and what we can't claim. So that's I think that's a really important thing to say. And I think that's probably all I'll say for now. That we've written some of this up already in academic papers. You'll see a list of them here, and we can share these with you. There's also, if you look down there, the fourth paper along, there is a mapping remunicipalisation report from last year, which gives you the trends and motivations and some of the background details on processes behind it. But I'll leave it there, and I think we're all open for a bit of a discussion.
Yes, Andrew, I think that, the time has been perfectly managed, and we have the last minutes if you want for question. I have some, but I want to give first of all the floor to the colleagues that are here, and please introduce yourself. And so we'll know also and on which sector you work. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentations. Very informative and useful. My name is Nanya Sudhir. I work with the Social Protection Department, but I have previously worked on smart cities and on urban mobility outside of this organization. So I guess my question to all of you was, where along the line does remunicipalization or municipalization get decided? Who decides that? I'm not sure I caught that correctly. Like, what are the push and pull factors for that? Is it something that is demanded or led by civil society stakeholders, or is it just a public policy decision? So yeah, that's just my question.
To Dari and James, what kind of the union representation form are you looking for? I feel like somehow, in a sense of a new setting.
My name is David Kapia, and I work in the Sectoral Policies Department on private services and utilities. Just maybe it's somehow related to what Yasuhiko just said in terms of shared ownership and other forms of ownership that are coming up. And in that light, I wanted to find out to what extent are you looking at public-to-public partnerships? Thank you.
And indeed, I think that you can wrap up all the three of you in the order that you want. I was just wondering, indeed, which kind of friends and possibility of collaboration with movements you have had, besides the trade unions dimension, and indeed, it's like across the political spectrum. But I think, what I think it's, we see a lot of new ideas from civil societies, but we don't know how much they connect with the request from the labor movement. So this was something that was coming to my mind. Indeed, for example, also on rethinking, I think that James spoke rightly about the right to mobility, so just like overcoming the privatization of the idea of one car or, these kind of things. But is it really going through, the message? And certainly also what I had in mind, it is which are, and I was reading one of your publication where you were talking also about sometimes the difficulties in the same labor movements of discussing between different unions, because I think we shouldn't be, indeed it was the labor dimension or remunicipalization. I found it very honest and very interesting about the fact that these things are not just, oh, okay, this is wonderful, but sometimes there is a cost in terms also of, for workers' rights and also for maintaining quality of jobs. And then, I think that it's really, really important that is the point that Andrew was making about how would you say it? The approach that is only looking at the national ownership. I'm Italian. We know from history that fascism was built on that, about the fact that you can offer things that services that are nationalized, but not in a democratic way, but just, and I think this is an enormous important point about the democratic aspect. So how do we make sure, again, allow me to say, we had in Italy the referendum on the water, against the privatization of water. A lot of us feel that it was a lost opportunity, that it wasn't really, the people were saying very clearly what they wanted, it wasn't followed up. So, how do we make sure that instead we create also that movement towards changing the access and the democratic ownership indeed. So I don't know how you want to handle the responses. Should we go in reverse order? And maybe Andrew start first. Thank you.
Could I take that last point? That's a really important point. I think the work that Daria and James are doing in trying, on the one hand, to get deprivatization on the agenda of big global organizations is really important. But for me, I think making visible this process of deprivatization and public ownership is really important as well, because I think there is this massive sort of gap. And I think, particularly if I think about the UK, where we now have we were talking at lunch, we now have before we have a Labour Social Democratic leadership that has now gone back on all the promises, even though they're massively popular, to bring services back into public ownership. It's for me, it's always important to present these cases of what's going on around the world, and I think it's partly fighting that battle at the global level to kind of confront the neoliberal narrative, or whatever you want to call it, and perhaps also that some, we've got to fight these battles at local and national level. But I think examples and cases. I'm always struck by the US examples where you get cities like Houston, which is hardly a municipal socialist hub, which is one of the cities that took its private water operator back into public ownership. So I think it's publicizing, and it's really getting the message out there and building the support. But I think it is a major problem when you have kind of referenda. The other one I can think of is the recent Berlin referenda around housing, which was passed massively, a massive popular mobilization. But of course, it's been blocked by kind of the mainstream political actors. So I think I think we have to be aware that those blockages and those actors are there, but we've also got to confront them with actually, these aren't utopian visions, they're democratic, practical examples. Examples like Paris are really nice because it happened some time ago, and it shows some positive outcomes. So I think we need more and more of those cases and arguments to do that. Could I also just ask I think there's some of the questions I'm going to leave to my trade union colleagues. I can come in later. But the question about who's deciding on this? It's a combination. Actually, what's interesting is the vast majority of remunicipalizations are taken by local political actors, not ideological. We could call them perhaps more pragmatic. But what we're finding is it's often the same actors, probably often from the same political parties that privatized, that very quietly bring things back into public ownership because they realize that they've lost key assets and resources to the public purse. So in a lot of cases, it's the kind of political actors in local government that have just taken these decisions. But I think, having said that, there are quite a lot of interesting campaigns where there is social mobilization. Hamburg, the energy grid is a really good example. There've been some of the earliest remunicipalizations were in Latin America in the water sector, and those were social movement mobilizations. France is really interesting as well. Grenoble, not so far away, was one of the first remunicipalizations in the 1990s, and that was a and that was a grassroots campaign as well. So there's a mixture, and there are some interesting social mobilizations. One of the things we're looking at in the US is some of the campaigns that are going on to reclaim energy from private operators. And there's a fascinating campaign in Maine, in the state of Maine, where they're trying to take back their energy grid from, it's the Spanish company Iberdrola actually that owns the grid there. And there's been a really interesting campaign to take back the energy grid, and it's crossed political affiliations. You know, it's a grassroots mobilization that's got Republican as well as Democratic support, and they actually passed a bill to take the grid back in the Maine Senate, and it was blocked by the Democrat governor. You know, classic you know, mainstream middle of the road politician looking for re-election and getting funding from some private utilities. That's the sort of thing you often find. But they're now going to a direct referenda now campaign in Maine later on this year, and we're kind of following that campaign. So it's very often under the surface. I mean, interestingly, in the UK, some of the insourcing remunicipalisation examples are actually done by Conservative councils, who rhetorically are still talking about the market and privatization, but very quietly, and under the table, they're often bringing things back into public ownership. So it's I wouldn't say there's a massive amount of social mobilization at the grassroots, but there are some really interesting examples where that does happen, and you get some interesting victories against the odds. And Hamburg's interesting because the whole political establishment was against that. That was against that remunicipalization. The other thing about I think there was a question about the collective bargaining agreements, and we do find, I think, some of the trade unions are, they're not always pro deprivatization or remunicipalization, particularly where trade unions have quite strong collective bargaining agreements with private utilities. That was the case in Hamburg. It's the case in Maine, actually, where there's an interesting, I think the campaign for remunicipalization in Maine is trying to negotiate this sort of trade union position because they have a very good collective bargaining relationship with the private utility. So that is an issue, and I think it's one thing that we try to confront and take head on. But the case from Hamburg is interesting because the conditions of the workers that were transferred in the public sector, they did maintain their collective bargaining conditions and agreements.
Okay. Thank you. It's a really thought-provoking set of questions and far too little time to answer them. So I'm going to run through these as quickly as possible, and then maybe we can follow up afterwards. On the question of who decides on remunicipalization, yeah, I'd very much echo what Andy said. I think it's a combination of kind of top-down technical and bottom-up political factors. One of the case studies that I did want to share, which we can afterwards, was from Seoul Metro in South Korea. And there was a landmark decision to take a big step towards municipalization of that one privately run line in 2019. And that was the result of a very long-standing campaign by the Korean Public Services and Transport Workers Union, which focused a lot on safety issues and also the underinvestment that had been taking place under private operation. But so there was a sort of combination of, there was the political will and the political push from the grassroots, but also some serious technical issues that had emerged from the private operation there. So I think it's often a mixture of the two. In terms of forms of union representation, yes, there obviously will have lots of different jurisdictions will have a difference between public and private systems of collective bargaining. There's also this case study from the Philippines is particularly interesting because it's an example of quite an innovative public community partnership where, as a means of formalization, the Transport Workers Union was supporting workers to set up worker cooperatives, which are now won contracts to run public transport services from local governments. So it's a form of deprivatization, which isn't traditional, doesn't result in traditional public ownership. It's a form of, I suppose, community ownership by the worker operators of the services. So I think there's a spectrum again of different options here. I'll leave the public-public partnerships to Daria because I know it's one of your favorite topics, but what I would say is through our relationship with C40 cities, I guess we're developing informal hubs, which is where there's a relationship that's been successfully built between local government and a union or unions, as happened in Jakarta recently over public transport. C40's network of cities, a lot of that is sharing technical expertise and knowledge between cities on a wide range of policy areas, not just transport. And that's something, so for example, Jakarta hosted a workshop, the Jakarta city government hosted a workshop last year for public transport officials from other local governments around the world. One of the things that was profiled was this just transition agreement with the public transport unions there. So I guess that's one way, even though it's not a formal hub in the way that's maybe happened in the water sector. Collaborations with allies, yeah, we and our affiliates are continually working with community groups. I've just noted down a few here from different parts of the world because there are some really dynamic local campaigns going on. Again, in the Philippines, with a group called Move as One, which represents passengers. There's a great collection or a great alliance in Glasgow involving local trade unions, but also passenger groups, environmental groups, pushing for the remunicipalisation and integration of public transport there. There's a group in New Zealand called Save Our Trains, who we were just speaking to last week, which again is a kind of union community alliance. So there's those are the most powerful cases, I think, where we have passengers and workers cooperating democratically in order to push this forward. The different approaches to mobility and the right to mobility. This is a huge topic. I guess the one message I want to provide is that there are different versions of this. I think what's given this right to mobility a real push is the recognition that the levels of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution we have are basically unacceptable and incommensurate, certainly with our multilateral climate goals. But there are different ways proposed in order to deal with that solution, and certain different interests involved. There is this idea that somehow if you could electrify every private vehicle in the world, then we will have solved the problem, but that is totally unrealistic for a whole range of reasons. So electrification is important, but it is going to be essentially useless without a modal shift towards public transport, which also then delivers a whole range of other benefits, social, economic, and so on. And I'll just finish very briefly with this point about varying forms of nationalisation, and to Andy's point about there being certain exclusionary forms of public ownership. We would always caveat any commitment to public ownership with the commitment to democratic control with it, because a remote state bureaucracy is in many cases no better than a remote private bureaucracy. Indeed, yeah, the benefits of public ownership can only be properly realized if there is genuine democratic control over those public entities. Again, there are a range of ways to achieve that, but it certainly can't be in any kind of autocratic way. Pass to you, Daria.
Yeah. Until the end of the discussion. On the question on how does remunicipalization happens, there's one manner that perhaps has not been mentioned, which is very frequent, in fact, and it is bankruptcy. The bankruptcy of the private operator who literally runs away with the money and disappears. And this is not something that happens in Italy only or in countries on the south. I have two examples which are very eloquent and speak to that. In Oslo, Vereno, which was the private operator for waste services, and it has been for many years, was employing very highly vulnerable migrant workforce, which barely spoke the language, couldn't really understand the contracts, sometimes didn't have written contracts, and was paid peanuts, working crazy hours at in very poor occupational health and safety conditions. And the residents of Oslo had alerted the municipality to the fact that the conditions of the workers were unacceptable, that the people who were picking up their trash were not in decent conditions. And then the company went bankrupt, left all the workers without employment, with no compensation, and they didn't pay them for 3 months. So what the municipality did at the time, passing it as a municipal council motion, was to put in a huge amount of money to insource it and take also the assets back. And I'll tell you just how much damage a long-term privatization of a service essential to public health and to the environment like waste services did. In Oslo, the service has the keys to access to the waste service rooms in the different buildings. The municipality no longer had the keys. The provider had run away with the keys, so they had to redo all the keys of these places to access the waste locals. And they had lost capacity. In the municipality, no workers were left. So if the bankruptcy had occurred, they weren't ready for the bankruptcy. They had to call out of retirement some of our union members from the union Fagforbundet, who had known the utility at the time when it was still public, to rebuild the service. This is just one example. So on the topic of the difficulties of unions to accept and be proactive on remunicipalization, because in some cases, especially workers in very strong multinationals, it's usually energy or water, may be opposing, and that is also human and understandable reaction. People are afraid. If you read this paper, we really interviewed the workers and the union officials to understand the Paris case, which was a very complex one. Why is Paris interesting? Because public sector workers in France, believe it or not, are very poor. The majority of public service workers in local government, which is actually the majority of the public sector employees in France, are on the SMIC, minimum wage. It's not even the living wage. You know that the French minimum wage is not reflective of what you need to live in a dignified manner. So it's clear that when Veolia and Suez pay very good wages, people are afraid to get into the public sector. But why? Because the public sector has been, and in France, has been in the past historically a champion of public services and government. But the reality is that little by little, salami privatization and the devoiding the meaning of the public sector in France and in the UK, and we're seeing it with the NHS, even if it is not a blatant privatization, is the salami privatization from the inside, with outsourcing, with public procurement first policies. I mean, in the NHS, through COVID, they discovered 11 layers of public procurement. And then people wonder, how come that protective personal equipment didn't get to the workers and they died? And this takes me to the point on public-public partnerships. Look, actually, a public-public partnership starts with what we call, for example, in the water sector, water Erasmus. It means bringing together public operators, officials, and workers to peer learn from each other. How do you operate your invaluable resource? Water is invaluable. It must be preserved and guarded as a public commons in a way which works for everyone, for the planet, for the people, for the economy, for everyone, because it's a commons. So that is a start. But the other way to run public-public partnerships is just a very economic argument. Small municipalities in rural areas have such small municipal budgets, and where countries are unitary and municipalities have very poor municipal fiscal systems and are heavily dependent on the willingness and the vagaries of political cycles of central governments, they must come together to pool their resources so that they can deliver some kind of service to their communities. There's a case which is quite telling, which is a case of welfare care campaign, which is an intermunicipal consortium. So basically a PUP, a public-public partnership, but in the region of Flanders, which is Kempen. And this case shows that when you have a PUP instead of a private outsourced service in a service which is so poor yet so essential as social welfare. These are the workers who go to homes, to private homes, to help disabled people or people in socially distressed or economic situation, or need any kind of support with their house chores or with health or raising a child as a single parent or with debt. This case shows that through COVID, it was thanks to the fact that the utility, the service was public and a pooling of the different resources of the small municipalities, that it could quickly adapt and redeploy staff to prioritize the most vulnerable among the users. Whereas if it, and this was not the union who told us, it was the public service manager. He said, texto, it's written in here, had this service been privatized, we would have had to renegotiate each and every single service with a private provider, and people would have died because we wouldn't have been quick enough to respond to the crisis. So just this point, and perhaps, I don't know if I answered to everything, but perhaps on another point that very important that Anna raised, she says, how do unions and civil society organizations work together on this? I always answer that public service workers have three hats. Of course, they're workers in a service, but they're also citizens or residents, and they can vote or become socially active, and they're also users. Many of our members in waste services, but any kind of service, even in public administration, in cities that have become gentrified, they cannot access the services they deliver in a decent way. Often in Brazil, in Toronto, they have to drive, because there's no public transport sometimes, hours to get to work to deliver quality services to affluent people who live in the city center because of this gentrification, because of housing speculation, and the complete dismissal of social and public housing stocks. And that is another area where we must reclaim housing as a basic right for people. And we've seen it through COVID, how important it is. And yet they live in slums or suburbs, sometimes even without access to reliable access to electricity, to water, to education, and to health. So just to tell you that.
Wow. So I think that this is definitely an excellent work, not only for the collaboration between two global unions, because very often we just find those who want to come only with one hat, but also together, unions talking to each other, finding solution with academia. Thank you so much, Andrew. I think it's excellent. I think we need to make known the database that the University of Glasgow is bringing, but indeed, you know, as you say, these are the good ideas for communities at large, not only for the world of work, but for a democratic ownership and society. I think that I hope that you will all follow the discussion on just transition and the discussion that we will have at the ILC, including rethinking industrial policies. I think all the points that you have made are absolutely crucial for the ILO work of the future. So thank you all for those who stayed here with us longer than we had foreseen. And for those, I hope that eventually found a way to follow us, and congratulations and best wishes for the future work. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.